organization, they have something they call academisch kwartiertje. I was bargaining for an academisch kwartiertje, but it wouldn't be nice if you all showed up in time to make you wait another 50 minutes. So I think we slowly go into transition and open in the evening. Thanks for being here. For those who do not know me, my name is Miguel. The topic for tonight is what can we learn from Singapore. I'm not a fan of the Singapore model. I studied the Singapore model.
No.
Okay. Who of you has visited Singapore? Okay. Okay. No problem. It's okay. Okay. For those who visited Singapore, have you ever wondered what would be nice if you would apply it in Curacao? Or you never ask yourself that question? Yeah.
Yes. Well, the organization grade in Singapore is completely different from here. It's the main difference in one sentence, I think.
Okay. Other people want to share? You raised your hand to another. Yeah. What have you learned from Singapore?
It's a long story.
Give us the short version.
There are various dimensions to the Singapore model. You want to apply it to yourself. One is the governmental structure and management of the country, which is a combination of very hard decisions that were made when they became independent. One is the way they organize. They do like, when they do a project, they do like a total approach. They look at the environment, they look at the business side, they look at the social side, and try to integrate it. That's for now.
Okay. Thank you for sharing. Let's see if at the end of the evening there are a few points we can take home with us.
Miguel, if I may add something. I never visited Singapore, but what I understand is that the mentality there is completely different than, let's say, the Latin American way of thinking.
Let's get into that. Okay. I visited Singapore in 2009. This is me on one of those tours on the Singapore ribbon in front of the Merlin, national symbol of Singapore. I was on a study trip, attending a conference, presenting a paper. It was another paper, but we were doing research with students, studying a few business models, few island models. What was happening in those days is that there was, every month there was a flavor of the month. First it was Singapore, Ireland, Barbados, New Zealand, among others, the VBC or union leaders. There was a time even Norway was considered a model, if I recall. But every month there was an island, and that island had the key to success. And that's, if we applied that in Curacao, we would succeed. So what I was doing is I was comparing these 5 cases, including Aruba, and coming up from what are the role models for Curacao. The article got published. I will give you the link so that you can see the article for yourself. We came up with the conclusion. So based on, part of what I'm presenting is based on that research and on that visit I did. When I landed on Singapore, and Carol is also here, we shared it last weekend or the weekend before that. The first thing that struck me is you arrive at Curacao. The climate is almost 100% the same. the clothes you wear is almost exactly what you wear here. So I traveled to Amsterdam, and in Amsterdam, of course, it was cold or chill. But when I arrived in Singapore, it was like coming home. The plants are almost identical. They have a little more Helgonia in their vegetation, but all the plants you see here would grow in any garden here. On another level, the multi-ethnicity, things like that. But there are other similarities that strikes you. They're big in oil refinery. Actually, they don't have one, they have 3 oil refineries. They have a huge container harbor. Those were a few things that immediately caught my attention. There are lots of other details, but you wonder, why would you consider Singapore as a model? Because when you arrive, it feels like very familiar. I will show you a short film on, it's from The Economist. It's done last month, I think. And in there they explain what Singapore is about and how it came about. All the links were.
When it started life as an independent, separate country in 1965, Singapore's prospects did not look good. Tiny and underdeveloped, it had no natural resources and a population of relatively recent immigrants with little shared history. The country's first Prime Minister, the late Lee Kuan Yew, is credited with transforming it. He called one volume of his memoirs From Third World to First. Why did Singapore become an economic success? First, its strategic location and natural harbour helped. It is at the mouth of the Malacca Strait, through which perhaps 40% of world maritime trade passes. It was an important trading post in the 14th century, and again from the 90s, when British diplomat Sir Stamford Raffles founded the modern city. Now it is at the heart of one of the world's most dynamic regions. Second, under Mr. Lee, Singapore welcomed foreign trade and investment. Multinationals found Singapore a natural hub and were encouraged to expand and prosper. Third, the government was kept small, efficient and honest, qualities absent in most of Singapore's neighbours. It regularly tops surveys for the ease of doing business. But the island city is not ideal. Although clean and orderly, it has harsh judicial punishments, a tame press, and illiberal social policies. Homosexual acts, for example, remain illegal, and protest demonstrations are rarely permitted. Mr. Lee saw his authoritarian style of government as an essential ingredient in Singapore's success, emphasising the island's vulnerability in a potentially hostile neighbourhood. But younger people now question whether Singapore really is that fragile and resent the restrictions on their freedom.
So, in this brief clip, the reporter makes a lot of statements. The geographical location, the leadership, attracting foreign direct investors. It's a lot of information. You should go home, I will send you the link, and listen carefully to what everything he states. I will be repeating a lot of what he states, or has stated. Okay. Singapore today, what can we learn? I thought I was the only one asking myself this question, but while preparing for this evening, I got this video clip that Americans are asking themselves this question too. By the way, I'm going to use several clips, so bear in mind. This is the second clip I want you to see, and how the United States, a group of journalists, ask themselves these questions and the answers they come up with. I hope all the links I put in here work.
All right, guys. Now, this year, one of the most revered
premier political figures in the entire world this week passed away. We're talking about Lee Kuan Yew, who took a poor nation with no resources and made it an economic powerhouse. Today, Singapore is admired by nations and leaders everywhere. But I got to tell you, his methods were very strict, and people, just some of the things people could be fined or jailed for. Things like not flushing public toilets, selling chewing gum, urinating in elevators, walking around your own house naked, and spitting anywhere. So upon further review, Steve Forbes, are there some things that we could take away from Singapore's success, or does our love of freedom stop us from having this sort of an economy, or stop us from fining people for not flushing toilets?
Well, we're here in New York. It would be nice to have public toilets and have laws about it. But yes, we can take away. One is low tax rates, 20%, relentlessly push down taxes, had a sound currency, which most developing countries don't have, and holds them back. Countries like Brazil, having a clean government, he pays government officials high salaries, so you have a very low corruption rate. Those are the things that take away. Island, no resources, powerful neighbors, covetous about that country. We made it work and made it secure, and was a great ally for the U.S. during the Cold War and the War on Terror.
I got to tell you guys, when I first moved to New York, I grew up on Army bases my whole life. Me, my mom, and my two brothers came to New York. We were penniless. We lived in one room in an apartment in Harlem. We got in the elevator the first time, and I smelled this smell. I never really understood what it was. It smelled like an eye of fresh paint. It was paint and pee. And I got to tell you something. I think about how this guy, I know it's iron-fisted kind of stuff, David, and he's probably against it, but there's something to be said about a society that respects itself.
I guess there is, but I have to, I'm a freedom advocate, and so I don't know if that's going to work here. I think the points that Steve made is what really drove the economy, was certainly drive our economy, and it's those kind of things that happen in Singapore. It's not, you forbid me to be in my house naked. I got a problem with that.
Real quick, Steve Cortez, though, has also been critical about America's short-termism, and he was critical about the fact that we only seem to elect mediocre people to run our country.
Well, Charles, I'm going to blow up here as a nationalist American. One thing, Lee Kuan Yew, his success and Singapore's success could have never happened if it weren't for the implicit security guarantees of the United States, by the way. Singapore lives under the protection of the Pax Americana, which most of the world, by the way, has enjoyed since World War II. So I think they should be thanking the United States rather than criticizing us that they're able to have this experiment of sort of authoritarian capitalism there in Asia.
Yeah, unfortunately, Pax Romana ended, Pax Britannia ended, and we'll see about this protection from the United States. All right, Payne.
I assume that was that. So you see that we are not the only one asking ourselves what can we take away from Singapore. There's a lot of criticism on Singapore as well. I want to come up with it in front so that to make sure that you know that I know. Because usually when I try to explain what we can take away from Singapore, it ends up that it's an authoritarian system. And I know. And I will show you what it means. And if we get that out of the way, let's discuss what can we take from Singapore, filtering out the fact that they are, some say, a dictatorship. This is Singapore today. Actually not today, a few weeks ago, but it has its culmination today.
Lee Kuan Yew is dead, finally. Why hasn't anyone said, fuck yeah, the guy is dead?
Sorry,
Lee Kuan Yew was a horrible person. Because everyone is scared. Everyone is afraid that if they say something like that, they might get into trouble, which, give Lee Kuan Yew credit, that was primarily the impact of his legacy. But I'm not afraid. So if Lee Hsien Loong wishes to sue me, I will oblige to dance with him. Come at me, motherfucker. Lee Kuan Yew, contrary to popular belief, was a horrible person and an awful leader to our country. He was a dictator, but managed to fool most of the world to think he was democratic. And he did so by still granting us the opportunity to vote, to make it seem like we have freedom of choice. However, during your rule, you controlled the entire media and education, proliferating nationalistic propaganda on a daily basis. Like right now, since Lee Kuan Yew is dead, all day you see 24-hour news coverage of necrophiliacs sucking Lee Kuan Yew's dick. And you place an excessive surplus of your books in popular bookstores. In most of his books, look at how he self-indulgently plasters reams of pages with these montage of pictures of his experiences. Like, ooh, look how much better I am compared to you. And of course, he is absolutely notorious for suing people who criticized him, forcing them into jail and leading them into bankruptcy. And apparently, his thirst for suing is hereditary too. So he created an environment where his blatant flaws as a leader were hidden because most people were afraid of criticizing him in fear of being found guilty by the judicial system that he controls. So everything that people hear is about how great Lee Kuan Yew is. Of course he is able to deceive people into voting for him. Despite our voting rights, he is undoubtedly totalitarian. Now, seeing what Lee Kuan Yew has done, I'm sure many individuals who have done similar things comes to mind, but I'm going to compare him to someone that people haven't really mentioned before, Jesus. And the aptness of that analogy is heightened, seeing how Christians seems to be a really big fan of him. They are both power-hungry and malicious, but deceive others into thinking that they are compassionate and kind. Their impact and legacy will ultimately not last as more and more people find out that they're full of bull. And Lee Kuan Yew's followers are completely delusional and ignorant, and have absolutely no sound logic or knowledge about him that is grounded in reality, which Lee Kuan Yew very easily manipulates. Similar to the Christian knowledge of the Bible and the work of a multitude of priests. On the surface, he seemed quite successful. He turned Singapore from a small seaport into a bustling metropolis, rife with skyscrapers and its own casino. World leaders seemed to like him, most notably Margaret Thatcher, and many foreigners and millionaires wished to invest in Singapore. But you look deeper, and you find out what the true nature of Lee Kuan Yew's Singapore is. I'm sure most of your parents have told you how luxurious Singapore is, and how if you go to another country it would be much harder and much more expensive. But all you have to do is do a Google search, look at our country's statistics, and you will find out how fucking delusional and ignorant and stupid your parents are. Most people in Singapore are struggling to make ends meet, and it is reported that Singaporeans work the longest hours in the world. We are one of the richest countries in the world, but we have one of the highest income inequalities, highest poverty rates, and our government spends one of the lowest on health care and social security. The money spent on the public is so low, it's more representative of a third world country. And yet the amount of taxes is one of the highest in first world countries. And political leaders in Singapore earns more than quadruple the amount earned by political leaders in the United States. They are acquiring so much money. Why aren't they spending it on the people? What are they actually spending it on? One time an SDP member told me that once they got into power, they are going to take the key and open every cupboard and search out all the information on the government spending to find out what those motherfuckers have been doing with all that money. And whenever somebody wonders online if the government is pocketing...
Is it enough? Okay. Good. This is Amos Yi. I'm certain of his first name, Amos. His last name is Yi. His sentence was today. Yes. He is guilty of 2 counts. He was arrested after this. So he put on YouTube. And he was prosecuted on two things. Sexual explicit content and offending a minority or a religious group, Christianity. And he was found guilty, and if I recall, his punishment, his sentence will be today or has been today. he might get 3 months for one and 3 years for another with a fine. But that's ironically, this is sources differ. The original source stated that he was 70 years old. Sources now say he is 60 years old. Yes. Ironically, he is a product of the education of Singapore. So, at the end, I will let Mr. Lee Kuan Yew himself have the last word on this. Let's see how this computer works. Geographically, where is Singapore? It's awkwardly, it's about the same level on the globe, but totally on the other side of the globe. Or not? Sasa. You went last year, 2 years ago? It's actually it's a peninsula, part of geographically Malaysia and Indonesia is nearby. It has a superficie of about 700 square kilometers, but they didn't start out with that. They started out with more or less, if I recall, 500 square kilometers. They gained a lot of land. Most of the sand they used, if I recall, comes from Malaysia, and there is now some trouble because they cannot buy more sand to gain more land. Interestingly is that Curacao is 444 square kilometers. So they are not even double of Curacao. They are the second more dense populated country in the world. They have a multi-ethnic society, 75% Chinese, 30% Malay, 9% Indian, 3.3% others. They speak several languages. What is interesting is that they were a British colony when they got their independence, ultimately in 1965, but it started in 1963. But from the start, Lee Kuan Yew, who was the first president, opted for English. It was the two motives. So we all speak so many languages, there must be one language for us to communicate with each other. He selected English, but that was not the only reason. He already foresaw that English would be the language to do business with the world. That was another important motive. They have all the important religions over there, and it's very active. And the ethnicity is also very visible, because you still have the Chinatown, Little India, all ethnicities have their concentrations in there, and they celebrate their culture, and religion is a very big part of that. They have currently, the last estimate I found is that they have 5.6 million inhabitants currently. They started out with less than 3 million. I think in the area of 2.2 million, they started in 1965. And as you will see, a big part of the success, the formula of what Singapore believes is attracting talent, people who want to invest, people who want to work to Singapore and make them become part of Singapore. So the population is still growing and growing rapidly. In 1959, Singapore had a GDP per capita of less than $500. I already explained the 250 square miles. And as you've seen in many of the videos, nobody considered them to have the potential to become what they have become. in this article, this is another source, I think that is The Economist as well, they came up with what they consider the success formula of Singapore. No corruption, no criminalism, meritocracy, integrity, and fairness to all. He designated that these were the principles that make Singapore a success. In capital letters is meritocracy. That is not my choice, it's a choice of the article, but I totally agree. One of the strong points of Singapore is that they select the best qualified person to do the job. Of course, there is always some discussion if it is nepotism or patronage, but basically it's very low. The philosophy was from the start, people can start from wherever they started, from whatever background they started with. If they excel academically, they would be rewarded with high positions.
But if you don't perform, you will also have to be.
That's part of it. Today, Singapore has a GDP of $55,000 per capita. So remember, they started at $500, less than $500, okay? They have a world-class education, and the numbers differ. I have seen another source today that 1 in every 10 people from Singapore is a millionaire. This source, The Economist, says that 1 in every 6 people from Singapore is a millionaire.
Including children.
I don't know. You mean, yes, I think it's the total population. Whatever, it's impressive. The start of Singapore, I started when the English arrived there. Briefly, it has been part of the Portuguese Imperium, but the British arrived in 1890. But even before colonial times, Singapore served as a trade point for the people around that area. And when the British arrived, they built on that tradition. They were occupied in the Second World War by Japan. And in 1960, as you know, the decolonization started over that as well, just as it started over here. So that's an interesting parallel. They dealing with issues like autonomy, we dealing with issues like autonomy, they from the British, we from the Dutch. From the 1960s, they started to think like Singapore as one corporation. Slowly, but what you see later on, the elite considers Singapore as one big corporation that is run like a corporation. The first plan, national plan, is that I find out was dated in 1960 and was the period from 1960 to 1964. And it was focusing on industrialization. They early on established an agency that had the authority to attract, convince foreign investors to invest in Singapore. They gained their independence in 1963, and there was a brief period that they would try to become one nation with Malaysia. That experiment failed due to racial issues. It was the birthday of Prophet Muhammad that led to racial riots, and over a dozen people were murdered. That was that incident led to the situation that Singapore had to go their own ways. The independence was achieved in 1965 when they separated from Malaysia. Another traumatic event was that you read it in the memoirs of Lee Kuan Yew, is when he was informed that the naval bases of the British were going to leave, and this naval basis was, as I've understood, very big and had a big economic impact. by leaving, they impacted the GDP with a drop of 30%. So that was a real challenge for Singapore. When you was already in charge, they briefly discussed financial aid, economic aid, but very soon Singapore, Lee Kuan Yew decided that he did not want aid from the United Kingdom because I don't know where he got those ideas in those days. He foresaw that it would make them dependent upon that economic aid and they would become addicted to economic aid. So from the start, he refused to have economic aid from the UK. The second plan started in 1966 and it covered till 1970. In the 1960s, part of his strategy was to form alliances with multinational corporations. What I found interesting in my study is when Texas Instruments was leaving here, they started in Singapore. It makes me wonder if there was a relation. Probably not, but it is an awkward coincidence. Texas Instruments was one of the first multinationals to start off that. Not coincidentally, the same ideas that were here were there too, that the people had the skills to make the transistors that they made here. Very detailed work, they were skilled, hard-working. So the same principles that why Texas Instruments came here were the same reasons why they went over there. And what Lee Kuan Yew did is that he selected the multinational companies he attracted to come to Singapore based on the skills of his people, that they were people who do those small jobs, you know, make transistors, things like that. So from the start, electronics was a very important part of his strategy when getting the multinationals to come to Singapore in the 1960s. In the 1970s, you see that he creates an alliance